Shana Tova, everybody. I'm wishing you all a meaningful fast. I want to take you back 3 years. I took the B'nai Aviv Israel trip to Har Herzl, Israel's military cemetery, and I deviated from our tour guide's itinerary, which included the staple visits to graves of Herzl and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin. And I took them to the final resting place of a young man named Max Steinberg, a 2012 birthright participant, so inspired by his experience, he joined the IDF. And then he was subsequently killed in Gaza during Protective Edge in 2014. And as I led the B'nai Aviv group to Max's grave, I think some of you may be in this room right now, I could hear from a distance the haunting and familiar El Malei Rachamim, the memorial prayer, and unbeknownst to us, it was Max Steinberg's yortzeit. It was the first time the Steinberg family had returned to Israel since burying their son 2 years previously alongside 30,000 strangers who attended his funeral. This was a more intimate gathering, maybe 75 people, and we looked on as his mother stood at the podium and admitted she initially had difficulty understanding her son's decision to join the Israeli army, that she'd never been to Israel herself, that none of it had made sense to her. And then upon returning to her son's grave on this trip, however, she found hundreds of crumpled up pieces of paper surrounding and cascading from his headstone as if it had snowed only there. Notes left by hundreds and hundreds of people. Too many to read, but she felt obligated to pull at least a handful, and voice trembling, she unraveled a single piece of paper and began to read aloud to those in attendance. "Dear Max," it said, "I didn't know you, but your story inspired me to be like you, to follow my dreams, my heart, move to Israel. And while your story was cut short, I pledge to be its continuation. Just as your story became my story will now become your story. The Jewish people will write your next chapters. I, says the note, I will pick up the pen and author the next pages on your behalf." And his mother took the note, put it in her pocket, and said to all of us in attendance, "I get it now. Now I understand." And what she got, my friends, was that even though her son's status in Israel before he died was Chayal Boded, lone soldier, because he came to Israel from the diaspora, Max was never really alone. 30,000 people attested to that after his death. She understood that we, every single person in this room, we are a people bound to one another through forms different than every other people in every other nation. The tie that binds us is one that cannot be seen. It's not the color of our skin. It's not the country of our birthplace. It's not culture. It's not culture. Max's mother discovered this, that the music of Fiddler on the Roof, matzo ball soup, is foreign to the Jew from Morocco. But if a Jew is persecuted in Casablanca, the Jew in Warsaw will scream. Shimon Bar Yochai, he professed 2,000 years ago, Leka echad mehen kulan margishin. When one Jew is injured, all Jews feel the pain. And conversely, if a bride and groom are hoisted onto chairs in Poland, the Jews in Yemen will dance. Because despite distance, the Jew has been connected by 1,000 invisible strands of the Spirit. We believe that at Mount Sinai, we all stood, ki ish echad b'lev echad, one person with one heart. You've heard that phrase before, forever connected in ways that defy time, space, reason. It's why we compulsively play Jewish geography with strangers, a topic I covered from this bima on Rosh Hashanah 5 years ago. Psychologist Erica Brown, she suggests that this is no inconsequential game. By the way, it's my favorite game. I played it with most of you. With a discovered connection, she writes, there's a small sense of relief. As a Jew, I am not alone in the universe. I am part of a remarkable network. Because being a Jew, my friends, is a statement of uniqueness, a recognition that there's something different about us. And it's that very uniqueness, that difference that draws us to one another. The single heartbeat born on Mount Sinai, still pulsing through 1,000 invisible strands of the Spirit that connect the Jew through time and across continents. But unfortunately, after 70 years, the Jewish people need a defibrillator to resuscitate that single heart pumping life into all of us. The 3,000-year notion of a shared Jewish narrative, the very idea of a Jewish people, has become so fanciful to some, it's become a punchline. In some circles, birthright was actually blamed for Max Steinberg's death. Alison Benedict, she was the editor of Slate magazine, she wrote the most widely circulated indictment. A birthright trip convinced an American with shaky Hebrew that he was ready to die for another country, read her subheading. Maybe, she wrote, maybe Max was especially lost or especially susceptible, or maybe he was just looking to do some good and became convinced by his birthright experience that putting on an IDF uniform and grabbing a gun was the way to do it. You spend hundreds of millions of dollars to convince young Jews that they are deeply connected to a country that desperately needs their support. This is what you get, she wrote. This is what you get. And Benedict really tipped her hand on Twitter. She lamented, I know why there are soldiers guarding a checkpoint. I just don't know why those boys from New Jersey are doing it instead of, say, going to Rutgers. Now, Benedict's rejection of the idea of a Jewish people, no longer an outlying opinion. Israelis and American Jews, we stare at one another from across an ocean, which in many ways puts us closer together geographically than we are ideologically. And we're saying, you know, we were young, naive, unaware or unwilling to recognize how our differences would swell and intensify. You keep the car, I'll keep the house. We've grown apart. At some point, our singularity diverged. If it ever really existed at all, we're now two peoples with two stories, Americans and Israelis. My friends, Israel and American Jewry are at risk of a divorce, and we need to stop it in its tracks. Now, Gil Troy and Natan Sharansky is at least a name you know. These are two intellectual giants when it comes to the global Jewish community. They co-published what can only be called a manifesto, and they titled it, Can American and Israeli Jews Stay Together as One People? And they meticulously sifted through the survey data from the 2013 Pew study to the most recent AJC report, and they point to an odd form of mirror imaging that reeks of resentment and condescension, but it makes total sense. Listen to their simplification of the problem we're having, us and the Jews from Israel. Their words. American Jews grumble. Before I read these are generalizations based on the data, not based on all of your opinions. American Jews grumble. And again, Gil Troy and Natan Sharansky wrote what I'm about to read. American Jews grumble. You insulted our former president, whom we loved. Now you love our current president, whom we hate. You see, I needed to be really careful with this one. Israelis return the volley. You American Jews loved your former president who threatened us. Now you hate your current president who protects us. American Jews, they continue, only 5% of whom are Orthodox, wonder, how can I be expected to fight the delegitimization of Israel when Israel's chief rabbinate delegitimizes my religious movement? To which the Israeli responds, how can we, who've built this land with our sweat and our blood and defend it 24 hours a day, take seriously the criticism of non-Orthodox American Jews who at a 70% intermarriage rate can't manage to stay Jewish? Is either group wrong? Should Should I, the rabbi of this institution, be championing a loyalty to a Jewish state that won't allow me to officiate at a wedding? Should the Israeli really take the criticism or critique of an American Jew seriously when our 18-year-olds are handed a keg cup and a textbook when they start college? Theirs are given an M16 and a Tanakh when they are inducted into the Israeli army. We protect our children from the horrors of the world by changing the channel. They protect theirs by turning the playroom into a reinforced miklat, a bomb shelter, just in case one of the thousands of rockets launched indiscriminately into Israel gets past Iron Dome. Sharansky and Troy summarized it. They summarized it best. Both Israeli and diaspora Jews are like stockholders who lack majority shares in each other's companies, but nevertheless want a voice in shareholder meetings. Listen to this actual exchange. This took place in 2017, 3 years after the war in Gaza and the death of Max Steinberg. An American Jew, still appalled by the disproportionate number of casualties, told a group of Knesset members visiting Boston, "You're losing me," she said. "You're losing me and many people in the Jewish community. I cannot look the other way when 3 Israeli teenagers are brutally murdered and the response is to kill 2,300 Palestinians." The visiting MKs, members of Knesset, they are both from the left and the right, the far left and the far right. And they sat there momentarily stunned by the simplification of the conflict, the blatant disregard for the thousands of missiles launched at Israeli civilian population, sending millions into shelters for weeks. The disregard for the hundreds of miles of terror tunnels, with entry points in Gaza schools or hospitals, and exit points in kibbutz dining halls or synagogues. The complexity of engaging an enemy that reduces its own citizens to human shields. Responding to the self-righteousness and ignorance of an American Jew whose most dramatic act of self-defense is closing her laptop, one of the members of Knesset said, "If I have to choose between losing more lives of Israelis, whether they are civilians or soldiers, and losing you, I will sadly, sorrowfully, rather lose you." That is the language of divorce. That is the language of the end of the Jewish people, and we cannot let that happen. The simple truth is that American Jews and Israeli Jews have freely chosen to inhabit very different political and social orders. Sharansky and Troy again lay it out for us. For the first time in 2,000 years, most Jews live under 2 radically different constitutional arrangements. Rather than being united by shared homelessness, half choose to live at home as a sovereign citizen in the Jewish homeland, and most of the other half feel at home elsewhere. How did this happen? The philosopher and best-selling author Alain de Botton gives it a try. Our problem is that before marriage, we rarely delve into our complexities. One of the privileges of being on our own is the sincere impression that we are really quite easy to live with. We can always be right. Our partners are no more self-aware. Naturally, we make a stab at trying to understand them. We visit their families, we look at their photos, we meet their college friends. All this contributes to a sense that we've done our homework. We haven't, he says. Marriage ends up as a hopeful, generous, infinitely kind gamble taken by 2 people who don't know yet who they are or who the other might be, binding themselves to a future they cannot conceive of and have carefully avoided investigating. And eventually, the only ingredient in common is the partner, and perhaps the only thing in common with the partner is disagreement. 70 years ago, at the onset of our relationship, it was easy to identify a common denominator. We, American Jews and Israelis, we did our homework to ensure compatibility, and we discovered that both here and there across the pond, our doorposts were marked by a mezuzah. Our children sang the 4 questions at Pesach, lit Shabbat candles on Friday, still got nervous before a bar mitzvah, stood under a chuppah at a wedding, and we identified a commonality and pledged allegiance to one another in good times and in bad until death do us part. And like all new couples, we were blinded to the more complicated, polarizing future, which is our present. And while we once thought that all that separated us was that our ancestors opted for Ellis Island, while theirs chose the port in Haifa, we now know we were wrong. 70 years ago, American and Israeli Jews stood under a proverbial chuppah with confidence, biding themselves to a future they could not have conceived of and carefully avoided investigating. And in 5779, it seems the only thing we have in common is disagreement. My friends, no ruler, no government in history has defeated us, fragmented our unity. But on occasion, we've defeated ourselves. It's happened 3 times. In the days of Joseph and his brothers, the Torah states emphatically, Lo yachlu dabro l'shalom, they could no longer speak peaceably together. The resentment between Joseph and his brothers, so deep, so profound that the brothers sold him into slavery, the catalyst that resulted in 210 years of persecution at the hands of the Egyptians. 2, a few years after the completion of the first temple, Solomon dies. His son takes over. The kingdom splits in 2. Abraham Lincoln said it best, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And that was the beginning of the end of both the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel. 3, the Roman conquest of Jerusalem in the 1st century. The Jews inside the besieged city were more busy fighting each other than the enemy outside, and that story ended in the destruction of the Second Temple. Sinat Chinam, baseless hatred and enmity amongst us, caused the 3 greatest exiles of Jewish history. When we split apart, disaster follows. And here's the silver lining. Both American Jews and Israelis know this to be true. 79% of American Jews in a recent AJC survey agree that a thriving Israel is vital for a Jewish future. 78% of Israelis say the same thing about us in the diaspora. In short, after 70 years, while we may be a house divided, neither American Jews nor Israeli Jews are ready to call it quits. From our side of the pond, here's what I think it will take to make this marriage work. The Goldsteins and the Cohens. They're sitting by a pool, and they're discussing this amazing restaurant the Goldsteins had been to recently. Morty Goldstein is raving. The service, the food, everything's spectacular. No, says Cohen, what's the name of this restaurant? I have to go. And Morty says, geez, I can't remember. Oh, what do you call the long stem flower people give to each other on special occasions? Cohen responds, you mean a rose? He says, yes, that's it, Rose. What was the name of that restaurant we went to last week? I love that joke. This is called transactive memory. Transactive memory. It's a theory that comes from University of Virginia psychologist Daniel Wegner, and it suggests that memory is more than facts inside our heads. That a lot of what we remember is stored outside our brains. We don't memorize phone numbers, for example. We memorize where to find phone numbers. Phone book, contact list. Transactive memory is when store information with other people. Couples do this automatically, creating an implicit joint memory system based on an understanding about who is best suited to remember what kind of things, be it the names of restaurants or the million other things for which we rely upon the memories of others. Shared memory is the bond of a relationship, the way couples finish each other's sentences, remember commitments, tell family stories. The measure of our intimacy with another is based on the degree to which our memory actually lives within another person. Israeli and American Jews have developed the same intertwining, shared memory. We have become Morty and Rose, a bickering, elderly couple that rely on each other to finish a proverbial sentence. Transactive memory. It testifies to the symbiotic nature of relationships, and American and Israeli Jews have evolved to become interdependent in ways we could not have foreseen 70 years ago. 70 years ago, when one of us paid the bills and the other safeguarded the house. That was the arrangement. But no longer is Israel the poor, scrappy cousin dependent on a financial lifeline from its wealthier relative abroad. And no longer are we dependent upon our tough, outspoken cousin to fight our battles for us in the global forum. Looking across the pond, Israeli American and American Jews must shift from saying, I'm saving you, to we need each other. And we do. Because when we rely on a spouse to finish a sentence or fill in the details of a story, divorce from that spouse leaves us with half a sentence and an incomplete story. We're no longer whole. In Wegner's words, it's a feeling akin to losing a part of one's mind, and the future of American Jewry is dependent on Israel, and vice versa. We are not saving each other. We literally need each other in order to exist as Jews. And nearly 80% of both populations understand this. To say that American Jews do not need Israel is to admit that this is the twilight of American Judaism. Now, Morty and Rose, they've been married for over 60 years. One afternoon, Rose goes flying into the dentist's office. Doc, I'm in a big hurry. I've got Betty and Sheila sitting in the car waiting outside. We're going to go play mahjong. I can't wait for any anesthetic. Forget about the anesthetic. Pull the tooth. Be done with it. The dentist thinks to himself, this is crazy. What a strange lady. But she's determined. She has to have her tooth pulled without using anything to kill the pain for the love of a card game with friends. So the dentist asks her, which tooth do you want me to pull? She turns to Morty and says, honey, open your mouth and show him your aching tooth. The most sublime act, wrote William Blake, is to set another before you. We all expedite a dental procedure for a spouse's card game in some form or another. But perhaps the greatest of all sacrifices that occur in a relationship is when we sacrifice the need to be right. And according to Alain de Botton, the person who's best suited to us is not the person who shares our every taste. He or she doesn't exist. But rather it's the person who can negotiate differences in taste intelligently. The person who is good at disagreement, because compatibility is an achievement of love, not a precondition. Compatibility is achievement of love, not a precondition. And my friends, disagreement is the common denominator of all relationships, especially between American and Israeli Jews. But what makes Morty and Rose unique is that disagreement and compatibility are never mutually exclusive. It's the opposite. Disagreement, or rather the way in which a Rose and a Morty disagree, allows for compatibility. The discord, the disconnect, while real, while threatening, is secondary to a more prominent unifying agenda. 2,000 years ago, the Mishnah reminded us, Kol machloket she'hi l'shem shamayim sofa litkayem, v'she'eino l'shem shamayim ein sofa litkayem. Every disagreement that is pursued for the sake of heaven will have a constructive outcome. But one that is not for the sake of heaven will not have a constructive outcome. A dispute for the sake of heaven, Hillel and Shammai. Not for the sake of heaven, Korach. What does that mean? Hillel and Shammai, the houses of study that represented the Yale and Harvard of first century Jews. They argued about the minutia of every mitzvah in the Torah. Every single one. But, Tashma, come and listen, says the Talmud. Though they disagreed over virtually everything, one permitting, the other prohibiting, the children from the school of Shammai and the children from the school of Hillel were encouraged to marry each other. Because at the end of the day, an argument l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, a disagreement that strengthens compatibility, always has we in mind, always is focused on a larger purpose, a greater good. That's the Jewish way to argue. It's permissible to argue I, so long as it is for the sake of we. This is what it means to sacrifice the need to be right. It's why two Israelis can nearly come to blows arguing and jostling for position at a deli counter during Friday afternoon pre-Shabbat shopping rush, but after they're separated by the store manager, they can turn loveling to each other and say, Shabbat Shalom. possible. But for Korach led a rebellion against Moses in the desert, and it was never about we. For Korach, the argument was I, for the sake of I. And for us American Jews, our default is to argue like Korach. It comes naturally to us by virtue of our upbringing. Individualism is an American virtue. The founders of our Constitution canonized our God-given right to argue for the sake of self-interest alone. I for the sake of I is paramount for democracy. But it's not good for a marriage. And it's not good for a family. And it's certainly not good for the Jewish people. If you disagree with a friend, tomorrow he may no longer be your friend. But if you disagree with your family for the sake of family, tomorrow they will still be your family. And the Jewish people is a family. Opting out of the family dynamic is opting out of Judaism. And so my blessing for us on Yom Kippur is for us to be an am kashe oref, a stiff-necked people. Be a stiff-necked people. That's right. I want us to be stubborn, obstinate people. In the Torah, that was God's impression of the Israelites in the desert. He says to Moshe, Ra'iti et ha'am hazeh, ve'hinei am kasher orafu. I've seen this people. It's a stiff-necked people. Cheref mameni v'ashmidem. Leave me alone so that I can destroy them. It was God's initial criticism of us. Moses' defense. Don't abandon them. Do not destroy them. Lo na yelechna Adonai b'kirbenu, ki am kashe orefu. Don't destroy them. Be among us, God, because they're a stiff-necked people. That's right. God's reasoning for destroying the Jewish people is the very attribute that Moses singles out in his defense of the Jewish people. Am kashe oref. We are stiff-necked. What is Moses saying to God? Listen to the words of Rabbi Yitzchak Nissenbaum, writing his understanding of Moses' defense of the Jewish people from inside the Warsaw Ghetto, right before he was put to death. Almighty God, look upon this people with favor, because what is now their greatest vice will one day be their most heroic virtue. They are indeed an obstinate people. When they have everything to thank you for, they complain. Mere weeks after hearing your voice, they made a golden calf. But just as now they are stiff-necked in their disobedience, one day they will be equally stiff-necked in their loyalty. Nations will call on them to assimilate, but they will refuse. Mightier religions will urge them to convert, but they will resist. They will suffer humiliation, persecution, even torture and death because of the name they bear and the faith they profess. But they will stay true to the covenant their ancestors made with you. This is a people awesome in its obstinacy, unparalleled in its stubbornness. And though it is their failing now, there will be times far into the future when it will be their noblest strength. And one of those times is right now. When it comes to the relationship between American and Israeli Jews, may we be stubborn in our loyalty to each other. May we recognize our shared memory that each is needed for the whole story. Without the other, there is no story. May our arguments and disagreements with each other be constructive, sometimes sacrificing our need to be right so as to create a gateway to compatibility, not a chasm of distance. My friends, in 5779, may the stiff-necked Jewish people live. Am Yisrael Chai.